Thanksgiving had always been a production at our house, a meticulously orchestrated event designed to showcase the Bennett family's picture-perfect life. Or at least, that's what my mother, Eleanor, strived for. This year felt different, though. A subtle undercurrent of tension hummed beneath the surface of the usual festive cheer. It centered, as most things did, around Grandpa George. He was, to put it mildly, a difficult man. Gruff, opinionated, and prone to making comments that could curdle even the sweetest gravy. But he was family, and tradition dictated his presence at our Thanksgiving table. This year, however, I, Olivia Bennett, had decided that tradition could take a back seat to my own peace of mind. Grandpa George had a particular knack for targeting me with his thinly veiled criticisms, usually masked as folksy wisdom. My career choices, my personal life, nothing was off limits. I'd endured years of it, biting my tongue and plastering on a polite smile. But this year, something inside me had snapped. I was tired of being the punching bag for his outdated views. As we all gathered in the dining room, the aroma of roasted turkey and cinnamon-spiced everything filling the air, Grandpa George settled into his usual spot at the head of the table. He surveyed us all with a familiar glint in his eye, a mixture of affection and judgment. When the platter of perfectly browned turkey was placed before him, a tradition he always presided over, he cleared his throat. "Well now," he began, his voice raspy with age. "Another year, another gathering of the clan. I'm thankful for many things." He went around the table, offering brief, predictable sentiments about family and health. When his gaze landed on me, I braced myself. "And I'm particularly thankful," he continued, a slight smirk playing on his lips, "that Olivia here is still employed." The jab, a reference to my recent career change that he'd openly disapproved of, hung in the air. My mother shot me a warning glance, but the years of simmering resentment boiled over. This was it. When it came time for the first toast, Grandpa George raised his glass of wine. "To family," he declared, his eyes meeting mine. "May we always find our way back to each other, no matter the detours." That's when I did it. I stood up, my chair scraping against the polished hardwood floor, the sudden noise silencing the room. All eyes turned to me, a mixture of confusion and apprehension on their faces. "Grandpa," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "with all due respect, I don't think you should be welcome in this family anymore." The silence that followed my announcement was thick enough to cut with a knife. My mother's face was a mask of horror, my father's jaw hung slightly open, and my siblings, Emily and Ben, stared at me as if I'd sprouted a second head. Grandpa George, for his part, looked genuinely taken aback, a flicker of hurt in his usually critical eyes. "Olivia!" my mother finally exclaimed, her voice trembling. "What on earth are you saying?" "I'm saying what we've all been thinking for years, Mom," I replied, my gaze unwavering. "Grandpa's constant negativity, his judgmental comments. It's not fair to any of us, especially not on a day that's supposed to be about gratitude and togetherness." "But he's your grandfather," Emily interjected, her voice laced with disbelief. "Being related doesn't give you a free pass to be disrespectful," I retorted, turning to her. "He's made me feel small and inadequate for years, and I'm done pretending it doesn't bother me." Grandpa George finally found his voice, a low rumble. "Is this how you truly feel, Olivia?" "Yes," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "It is. I think it would be better for everyone if you weren't here." The room remained in stunned silence for another moment, before my father, always the peacemaker, attempted to intervene. "Now, hold on a minute, everyone. Let's not say things we'll regret." "I won't regret this, Dad," I said firmly. "This is long overdue." The tension in the room was palpable. My mother looked like she might burst into tears. Ben shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. The festive atmosphere had completely evaporated. replaced by a heavy cloud of unspoken words and hurt feelings. Grandpa George, his face now a mixture of sadness and anger, slowly rose from his chair. "Very well," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "If that's how you feel, Olivia, then I will leave." He walked slowly towards the coat closet, the weight of his years suddenly seeming more apparent. My mother hurried after him, her protests a low murmur that I tried to ignore. Emily and Ben exchanged worried glances. My father sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. I stood my ground, a strange mix of triumph and unease churning within me. I had finally spoken my truth, but the fallout was clearly going to be significant. The rest of Thanksgiving dinner was a strained and awkward affair. The delicious food might as well have been cardboard for all the enjoyment anyone derived from it. My mother returned from seeing Grandpa George out, her eyes red-rimmed and her usual cheerful demeanor completely gone. She barely spoke, her disappointment radiating across the table. Emily tried to lighten the mood with some innocuous small talk, but her efforts fell flat. Ben remained mostly silent, occasionally shooting me a look that I couldn't quite decipher. A mixture of disapproval and perhaps a hint of understanding. My father attempted to steer the conversation towards neutral topics, but the elephant in the room, or rather the empty chair at the head of the table, was impossible to ignore. Later that evening, after the remnants of the feast had been cleared away and the uncomfortable silence had stretched on for hours, my mother finally confronted me. "Olivia," she began, her voice soft but firm. "How could you do that to your grandfather? On Thanksgiving of all days?" "Mom, you know how he makes me feel," I replied, trying to keep my tone even. "He's always criticizing me, making me feel like I'm not good enough. He's just old-fashioned," she said, attempting to defend him. "He doesn't always mean what he says. That doesn't excuse his behavior," I countered. "And frankly, Mom, it's not just about me. He's critical of all of us, in his own way. But to banish him from the family..." She trailed off, shaking her head in disbelief. "That's a very harsh thing to do, Olivia." "Maybe it is," I conceded. "But I needed to do it for my own well-being. I can't keep subjecting myself to his negativity." The conversation went on for a while, a circular argument with no real resolution. My mother couldn't understand my perceived harshness, and I couldn't understand her willingness to tolerate Grandpa George's behavior year after year. Emily and Ben joined the discussion at various points, expressing their own perspectives, mostly leaning towards a desire for peace and reconciliation. As the evening drew to a close, the family dynamic felt irrevocably altered. The easy camaraderie that had once characterized our gatherings had been replaced by a palpable tension. I retreated to my room, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and a growing sense of unease. I had stood up for myself, but at what cost? The days following Thanksgiving were filled with a heavy silence. My mother barely spoke to me, her disappointment a tangible presence in the house. Emily and Ben were polite but distant, their usual warmth replaced by a cautious reserve. The phone remained stubbornly silent. No calls from aunts, uncles, or cousins, all of whom I knew would have heard about the Thanksgiving debacle through the family grapevine. I tried to go about my daily routine, immersing myself in work, but the weight of my actions hung over me. I replayed the scene in my head countless times, the firmness in my voice as I told Grandpa George he wasn't welcome, the stunned looks on my family's faces, the hurt in his eyes. A small seed of doubt began to sprout within me. Had I gone too far? Was there a less drastic way I could have handled the situation? Then came the calls. First, my Aunt Carol, Grandpa George's eldest daughter. Her voice was tight with anger. "Olivia, I can't believe what you did. How could you treat your grandfather like that? On Thanksgiving. He was so upset." "Aunt Carol, you know how he's always been," I tried to explain. "His comments..." "He's family, Olivia. You don't just banish family because they say things you don't like. He's getting old. This might have been his last Thanksgiving with all of us. Her words hit me harder than I expected. The thought of never seeing him again, despite the pain he had caused me, sent a pang of something akin to guilt through my chest. Other calls followed, each one echoing a similar sentiment of shock and disapproval. I tried to defend myself, to explain my years of feeling belittled, but my words seemed to fall on deaf ears. In their eyes, I was the villain, the one who had shattered the family peace and hurt a vulnerable old man. The isolation was starting to wear on me. I missed the casual chats with my siblings, the comforting presence of my mother, even the distant connection I had with the wider family network. The satisfaction I had initially felt at standing up for myself was slowly being replaced by a hollow ache. Was this the price of my newfound assertiveness? As I sat alone in my living room one evening, the weight of my decision pressing down on me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake. Perhaps I had let years of accumulated frustration cloud my judgment. Perhaps there were other ways to address the issue without resorting to such a drastic and public confrontation. The silence of the house felt deafening, a constant reminder of the fractured state of my family. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Weeks turned into a month, and the icy atmosphere within our household showed no signs of thawing. My mother remained emotionally distant, her interactions with me brief and formal. Emily and Ben continued to keep their distance, their conversations polite, but lacking their usual warmth and candor. The absence of Grandpa George hung over us all, a constant, unspoken presence. The festive season, usually a time of joyful gatherings and shared traditions, felt muted and hollow. Christmas was particularly difficult. The usual flurry of present wrapping, carol singing, and family games was replaced by a quiet, almost somber observance. Grandpa George's absence was keenly felt, a stark reminder of the rift that had formed within our family. Even though his presence often brought its own set of challenges, his absence created a void that no amount of forced cheerfulness could fill. I found myself increasingly isolated. My usual support system, my family, was now fractured. The friends I tried to confide in offered sympathetic words, but they couldn't truly understand the complexities of my family dynamics or the weight of my decision. I started spending more time alone, lost in my own thoughts, replaying the events of Thanksgiving and questioning my actions. The initial sense of empowerment I had felt had completely dissipated, replaced by a gnawing sense of guilt and regret. I started to remember the good times with Grandpa George, the stories he used to tell about his childhood, his surprisingly witty sense of humor, the pride he had shown, in his own gruff way, at some of my accomplishments. These memories, once buried under layers of resentment, now surfaced with a painful clarity. I realized that my perception of Grandpa George had been filtered through the lens of my own insecurities and sensitivities. While his comments were often insensitive and critical, perhaps they weren't always intended to be malicious. Perhaps they were simply a product of his generation, his upbringing, his own set of unspoken anxieties. The thought of reaching out to him crossed my mind, but pride and uncertainty held me back. What would I say? How could I possibly undo the harsh words I had spoken? The chasm between us seemed too wide to bridge. As the new year dawned, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had irrevocably damaged something precious. My desire for peace and self-respect had inadvertently led to a deeper, more painful conflict. The silence in our house was no longer just uncomfortable. It was suffocating. Driven by a growing sense of remorse and a desperate need to mend the fractured bonds within my family, I decided to seek out Grandpa George. It wasn't an easy decision. Pride still lingered, and the fear of rejection was palpable. But the weight of my actions had become too heavy to bear. I managed to get his address from my aunt, who, while still cool towards me, recognized the sincerity in my voice when I explained my intentions. The drive to his small apartment on the other side of town felt long and fraught with anxiety. What if he refused to see me? What if he was still angry and hurt? When I finally arrived, I hesitated before knocking on the door. Taking a deep breath, I raised my hand and gently rapped on the wood. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Just as I was about to turn away, the door creaked open. Grandpa George stood there, looking older and more frail than I remembered. His eyes, though still sharp, held a weariness that tugged at my heart. He didn't say anything, simply looked at me with a mixture of surprise and guarded curiosity. "Grandpa," I began, my voice trembling slightly. Can I come in for a moment?" He hesitated for another moment before slowly stepping aside. I entered his small, sparsely furnished living room. It smelled faintly of old books and pipe tobacco, a familiar scent from my childhood. We stood in awkward silence for a few moments, neither of us knowing quite what to say. Finally, I broke the silence. "Grandpa, I wanted to apologize." The words felt inadequate, clumsy, but they were a start. What I said at Thanksgiving, it was wrong. It was hurtful, and I regret it deeply. He remained silent, his gaze fixed on me. I could see a flicker of something in his eyes, not anger, but perhaps a deep sadness. "I was angry," I continued, my voice gaining a little more strength. "Angry at the things you've said over the years, the criticisms. But that doesn't excuse my behavior. I shouldn't have done it the way I did, especially not on Thanksgiving, and especially not in front of everyone." The silence stretched again, thick with unspoken emotions. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what his reaction would be. Grandpa George finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "You caused a lot of pain, Olivia. To everyone." "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm truly sorry. I didn't think about how my actions would affect the rest of the family. I was so focused on my own hurt feelings." He nodded slowly, his gaze softening slightly. "I've said things over the years, things I probably shouldn't have." He paused, a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. "I just wanted you to do well, to be strong." His words surprised me. I had always interpreted his criticisms as disapproval, never as a misguided form of encouragement. "I know, Grandpa," I said softly. "But sometimes the way you said things, it just made me feel worse." We talked for a long time that afternoon. I listened as he spoke about his own regrets, his own frustrations with getting older, his fears about the family drifting apart. He wasn't the caricature of the grumpy old man I had built up in my mind. He was a flawed human being, just like me, trying to navigate the complexities of family and life. I shared my own feelings, my insecurities, the pressure I felt to live up to the family's expectations. For the first time, we truly listened to each other, not as adversaries, but as two members of the same family trying to understand each other's perspectives. By the time I left his apartment, a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Grandpa George hadn't immediately forgiven me, and I didn't expect him to. But the ice had begun to thaw. We had opened a line of communication, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope for reconciliation. The road ahead would still be challenging. Repairing the damage I had caused to my relationship with my parents and siblings would take time and effort. But I had taken the first step. I had acknowledged my mistake and reached out to the person I had hurt the most. And in doing so, I had begun the long process of healing. Returning home after my visit with Grandpa George, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The heavy cloud that had been hanging over me had lifted, replaced by a cautious optimism. I knew that one conversation wouldn't magically erase the hurt I had caused, but it was a start. I decided to approach my mother first. She was in the kitchen, quietly washing dishes, her usual humming absent. I took a deep breath and stepped into the room. "Mom," I began hesitantly. She turned to face me, her expression wary. Olivia. I went to see Grandpa George today, I said, watching her reaction carefully. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, followed by a look of apprehension. And I apologized, I continued. I told him I was wrong for what I did at Thanksgiving. My mother remained silent for a moment, her gaze searching mine. Then, slowly, a hint of relief softened her features. He told me you called, she said quietly. He sounded surprised. We talked for a while, I explained. It wasn't easy, but I think he understood where I was coming from, even if he didn't agree with my actions. A small smile touched my mother's lips. Your grandfather can be stubborn, but he has a good heart. I'm glad you reached out to him, Olivia. The conversation that followed was tentative but meaningful. I apologized to my mother for the pain I had caused her and the rest of the family. I explained that while Grandpa George's comments had hurt me deeply, I had handled the situation poorly. My mother, in turn, admitted that she had often felt caught in the middle, wanting to support both her father and her children. It took longer to mend the fences with Emily and Ben. They were more reserved, their hurt stemming not just from Grandpa George's absence, but also from the disruption of our family traditions and the uncomfortable atmosphere that had permeated our home for weeks. I approached them individually, acknowledging their feelings and expressing my sincere regret. Slowly, cautiously, they began to thaw. The process of rebuilding trust and repairing relationships was gradual. There were awkward silences and moments of lingering tension. But there was also a newfound willingness to communicate, to listen to each other's perspectives, and to move forward. The heavy silence that had once filled our house began to dissipate, replaced by the quiet murmur of tentative conversations and the occasional shared laugh. As Thanksgiving approached again, a year after the initial conflict, the atmosphere in our home was markedly different. There was a sense of cautious optimism, a shared hope for a more peaceful and harmonious gathering. The question of whether to invite Grandpa George hung in the air, unspoken but present in everyone's minds. One evening, my mother broached the subject. Olivia, she began hesitantly, your grandfather, he's been asking about us. I nodded, a sense of anticipation building within me. I had maintained contact with him over the past year, our conversations growing increasingly comfortable and genuine. We had even managed a few quiet lunches together. How would you feel if we invited him for Thanksgiving this year? My mother asked, her eyes searching mine. A wave of relief washed over me. This was what I had hoped for, what I had been working towards. I think that would be wonderful, Mom, I said, a genuine smile spreading across my face. We discussed the logistics as a family, agreeing that this year would be less about rigid tradition and more about creating a welcoming and inclusive environment for everyone. Emily and Ben voiced their support, acknowledging the progress I had made in mending my relationship with Grandpa George. When Thanksgiving Day arrived, there was a palpable sense of anticipation. The aroma of roasting turkey filled the air, but this year, there was a lightness to the atmosphere that had been missing the previous year. When the doorbell rang, my father went to answer it. Grandpa George stood on the doorstep, looking a little more frail, but with a warm smile on his face. He hugged my mother, and then turned to me. Olivia, he said, his eyes twinkling. Grandpa, I replied, a genuine warmth filling my chest. As we all gathered around the table, there was a sense of quiet gratitude. Grandpa George offered a toast, his words heartfelt and inclusive, expressing his thankfulness for family and forgiveness. This year, when his eyes met mine, there was no hint of criticism, only a gentle understanding. The day wasn't perfect. There were still occasional awkward moments, old habits that surfaced briefly, but overall, it was a testament to the power of communication, forgiveness, and the enduring bonds of family. I knew that the road to complete healing was still long, but we had taken a significant step forward. The following year brought a sense of stability and a deeper understanding within our family. The incident of the previous Thanksgiving, while painful, had ultimately served as a catalyst for much-needed change. Communication had improved, and there was a greater willingness among all of us to acknowledge each other's feelings and perspectives. My relationship with Grandpa George continued to heal. We developed a genuine connection, built on mutual respect and a newfound openness. I learned more about his life, his struggles, and the experiences that had shaped him. He, in turn, seemed to appreciate my honesty and my efforts to bridge the gap between us. Our conversations were no longer fraught with tension, but filled with a comfortable camaraderie. My relationships with my mother, Emily, and Ben also grew stronger. We had weathered a difficult storm together and emerged with a deeper appreciation for the importance of family and forgiveness. The unspoken resentments and misunderstandings that had once lingered beneath the surface had been replaced by a more open and honest dynamic. Life, of course, continued to present its challenges. There were still disagreements and occasional moments of frustration. But the foundation of our family had been strengthened, built on a willingness to listen, to empathize, and to forgive. Looking back on the Thanksgiving when I had asked Grandpa George to leave, I felt a pang of regret for the pain I had caused. But I also recognized that it had been a necessary, albeit drastic, step in our family's journey. It had forced us to confront long-standing issues and ultimately led to a more authentic and loving connection. I had learned a valuable lesson about the power of my words and the importance of considering the impact of my actions on others. I had also learned that even the most strained relationships can be mended with sincere effort and a willingness to forgive. The consequences of my actions had been significant, but ultimately, they had paved the way for healing and a stronger, more resilient family unit. The road had been difficult, and I had certainly played the role of the villain in our family drama. But in the end, I had also learned the profound value of empathy and the enduring power of familial love.